Welcome to a deep dive. You've given us quite a stack of sources here covering some really significant recent political developments.
Yeah, definitely. And our job, as always, is to unpack this material for you.
Exactly. We'll pull out the most important knowledge, the key insights, basically give you that shortcut to understanding what's really going on behind the headlines in this material you sent over.
We're looking at, well, quite a range. There's court battles over trade policy, the fallout from a pretty high-profile advisor leaving his role.
And some, let's say, controversial uses of executive power.
Right. Things that might seem disconnected at first glance.
But as we dig in, I think you'll see some surprising connections emerge.
So let's jump right into this material.
Okay, first up. Let's unpack these sources talking about the challenges to trade policy. There was a recent court ruling on tariffs that's, well, pretty striking.
It really is. You got the U.S. Court of International Trade unanimously ruling that some of the president's tariffs were actually illegal.
Unanimous is key there. And the panel, it included an appointee from this current administration, right?
That's right. Even with one of his own appointees, it was still a 3-0 decision against those specific tariffs.
And that initial ruling, it wasn't messing around. The court said, basically, stop these tariffs immediately.
Yeah, an immediate pause. And more than that, they ordered refunds for companies that had already paid up. Imagine being one of those companies.
Quite the windfall. But the story didn't stop there, did it?
No, not at all. The administration, as you probably expect, filed an immediate appeal.
And the outcome of that?
Well, an appeals court stepped in and said, okay, the tariffs can stay in effect for now while the main case works its way through the system. The material you shared calls it a slight setback to that initial ruling.
Okay, so the legal battle continues. But here's where the sources get kind of wild. This initial court decision apparently landed the same day the president had a notable reaction to a reporter's question.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
About the nickname. The Wall Street nickname for his trade approach.
Taco trade.
Which, the sources clarify, stands for Trump always chickens out.
Ouch!
Pretty blunt phrase from the analysts.
Yeah, and according to this reporting, when a journalist actually asked him about taco trade, he called it the nastiest question.
He didn't like that one bit.
And there's this strange detail where he apparently first thought taco meant like kick out, as in deporting people.
Really? Before he understood the acronym.
Yeah, before realizing it stood for always chickens out. And the sources say that phrase reportedly hurts deeply in his soul, which is quite the image.
Wow. Okay, well, politics aside for a second, the legal reasoning behind that initial ruling is important.
Right. What was the core argument?
It hinges on the law used to justify the tariffs in the first place, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. The court basically said, hey, this law lets the president do a lot of things in an emergency, but it doesn't explicitly list tariff as one of those tools.
Interesting. So a question of statutory interpretation?
Exactly. And the immediate result of all this legal back and forth, as described in your sources, just more chaos and uncertainty for businesses.
Which is never good. Businesses hate uncertainty. It's described as bad for the economy.
Makes sense. And it's telling, isn't it, that the markets actually reacted positively when that first court ruling came down, the one pausing the tariffs.
Right. Less uncertainty, maybe lower trade barriers. Wall Street liked that.
So the big question now is, where does this go? The sources seem pretty confident this is heading towards the Supreme Court.
Which opens up a whole new can of worms, right? Because the justices, even the conservative ones, don't all see eye to eye on presidential power, especially in areas like trade.
And the administration's position, based on this material, seems to be that, look, if Congress doesn't act on tariffs, the courts should just butt out.
But the sources push back hard on that idea, saying, well, that's constitutionally questionable. Just because Congress is gridlocked doesn't mean the president gets a blank check.
Yeah, the separation of powers is kind of central there.
Politically, the analysis in the sources is interesting, too. On one hand, having your big signature policies smacked down by the courts, that can make you look weak and ineffective.
Sure, not a good look.
But there's another angle presented. Maybe, just maybe, it could politically help the president by stopping his own tariffs from doing more economic damage, like saving him from himself in a weird way.
It's the theory. Though the sources also argue that tariffs have already done significant damage to his image as an able manager of the economy.
And they make the crucial point that even though overall inflation has cooled, prices for everyday people haven't really come down much. That's still a major political headache.
Absolutely. That hits people directly.
Okay, so that trade ruling, it touches on executive action. Let's pivot to another figure who just finished a stint using, well, a form of executive influence, Elon Musk. Your sources discuss his time in a White House advisory role, sometimes using that nickname Doge for him or his initiative.
Right. His 128 days as a special government employee have officially come to a close.
And he came in with these just massive promises, didn't he? First, it was cutting $2 trillion, then he revised it down to $1 trillion. Still enormous figures.
Huge numbers. But the reality, according to the reporting you shared, looks quite different.
How different?
Well, Musk himself apparently claimed savings around $165 to $175 billion. But reporters looked into it and found, that number seemed inflated. It included projects already canceled, things counted twice, that sort of thing.
Too creative accounting, perhaps?
Potentially. The actual package of cuts that reportedly went to Congress for a vote, just $9 billion.
$9 billion compared to the trillion promised.
Exactly. And this is happening while another big bill is projected to add something like $4 trillion to the deficit over time.
So the net effect? Well, the argument in the source is pretty blunt. They say despite all the talk about efficiency, his actions probably ended up costing the government more.
Yeah, one source even suggests his ineffectiveness and stupidity actually increased the deficit.
Really?
The example given is cutting the IRS seems like savings, but if they collect less tax revenue as a result.
Right, it backfires. And the sources really focus on the tangible, real-world consequences linked to cuts influenced by his initiative. These aren't abstract numbers.
They're pretty stark. Things like Social Security offices closing, making it harder for seniors to get help, layoffs at after-school programs.
FEMA facing cuts right before hurricane season kicks off. That seems ill-advised.
There's also a really grim detail about food aid. Rations paid for by the U.S. meant for millions globally,
Right.
apparently rotting in warehouses because the funding for distribution or related aid got cut.
That's awful.
And the reporting from places like Africa, highlighted in the material, talks about potentially millions of deaths from HIV, hunger, TB, polio, because prevention and treatment programs lost funding. People reportedly dying now.
And it's not just overseas. The sources mention impacts here too, like life or death delays for cancer patients and others needing medical treatments because of cuts at the National Institutes of Health, the NIH.
So yeah, the overall assessment of his legacy in these sources is not positive, summed up by that sarcastic phrase, great work all the way around.
Does the material suggest he can bounce back from this? Rehab his image, as they put it.
There's a lot of skepticism. The feeling seems to be no amount of rehabilitation is going to help, that the damage is permanent, and there's doubt he has the self-discipline to stay quiet moving forward.
The sources also pull out some political symbolism here. The image of the world's richest man spearheading cuts to programs for the poor, for cancer research.
Yeah, it's presented as a perfect metaphor for the bureaucratic cruelty that these sources associate with the Republican Party's approach.
And politically, for opponents, he's framed as almost a gift. A great gift to Democrats, a high-profile punching bag who helps mobilize the opposition. They specifically mention his role in that Wisconsin Supreme Court race as an example.
His involvement definitely energized people on the other side there.
Okay, from cost-cutting controversies, let's shift to another set of policies detailed in your sources, these ones targeting higher education and specifically international students. Some pretty significant moves reported here.
Yes, there's reporting about a policy to stop issuing all new student and exchange visitor visas, the stated reason, to create some kind of process to monitor their social media accounts.
A pause on all new visas, that's huge. And there's a specific focus on students from China, right?
Very specific. A national archivist is quoted saying the State Department plans to be aggressively revoking visas for many of the, 275,000 Chinese students already here.
On what grounds?
It targets those with supposed ties to the Chinese Communist Party, which the sources interpret as basically meaning anyone from China, and particularly those studying in critical fields. Think STEM science, tech, engineering, math.
So a broad sweep potentially affecting tens of thousands. And wasn't there also talk of just capping foreign enrollment overall?
Yeah, the president apparently floated the idea of a cap, maybe around 15% foreign students, maximum at any given college.
And then there's the targeting of specific institutions like Harvard. The sources mention attempts to cancel basically all federal funding to Harvard.
Right. And the crucial context provided is that a lot of that federal money isn't just for liberal arts classes. It funds vital medical and scientific research that benefits the whole country.
So cutting Harvard funding isn't just hurting Harvard.
That's the argument. Now, the justifications offered for all this, the sources find them pretty messy.
How so?
Well, you have one spokesperson talking about needing more plumbers and wanting less LGBTQ graduate majors. Then another figure tries to give a more intellectualized rationale about research funding crises.
Okay.
But then the president himself apparently just says it's about too many foreign students, maybe some are terrorists. The sources just label the whole thing incoherent.
Different messages, potentially conflicting goals, and what about the consequences? What do the sources predict will happen if these policies are fully implemented?
They predict it'll backfire badly. They call the policies self-defeating, saying they'll actually lead to less jobs in the U.S., not more, and could seriously damage, even destroy, some top American universities.
How would it lead to fewer jobs?
It comes back to this idea of brain drain. For decades, the U.S. has attracted the world's best students. They come here, get educated, and crucially, many stay. They work here, start companies here.
The sources list some big examples, don't they?
Yeah, companies like Google, eBay, YouTube, NVIDIA, SpaceX, Tesla, all pointed to as having immigrant founders or co-founders who benefited from the U.S. system. The fear is these policies will just push that top talent to go elsewhere.
So they'll start the next Google somewhere else.
That's the concern. It's framed as an anti-innovation agenda that could cause the U.S. to lose its competitive edge, maybe fall behind countries like China, which is already surging ahead in areas like drug trials, according to the material.
And there's a direct economic hit too, right? Beyond just innovation.
Absolutely. International students contribute something like $4 billion a year to the U.S. economy. They support nearly 380,000 jobs.
Wow, that's significant.
And a key point is that many of them, especially in graduate STEM programs where U.S. enrollment is actually falling, pay full tuition. That money effectively subsidizes the university's operations and helps provide financial aid for American students.
So kicking them out could mean...
Could mean more cuts to colleges, possibly higher tuition for other students, and maybe less students being able to go overall because the finances don't work anymore.
And the sources circle back again to that idea of incoherence, pointing out the seeming contradiction of targeting Chinese students so aggressively, while, for instance, letting a huge Chinese-owned social media app like TikTok operate relatively freely.
Yeah, the logic doesn't quite seem consistent, at least as presented here.
Okay, this brings us to the final major topic covered in the material you provided, the recent pardon spree. And the sources don't mince words. They say none of this is good news.
No, the tone is pretty critical. The reporting indicates the president has granted at least 25 pardons and commutations just recently.
And who's getting them? Is there a pattern?
The pattern identified in the sources is pretty clear. The primary beneficiaries are described as political cronies and financial supporters.
Can you give some examples from the material?
Sure. There are former reality TV stars convicted of things like tax evasion and bank fraud, but noted as being huge Trump supporters. There's a former congressman convicted of tax fraud,
Okay.
a former sheriff convicted of taking bribes, who's described as a minor magi celeb known for his anti-immigrant stance.
Right, but one case really stands out in the sources, doesn't it? Paul Walzak.
Yes, the Walzak case is presented as kind of the poster child for what the sources see as wrong with this process. He was convicted of tax fraud, cheating people.
And how did he get a pardon?
According to the reporting, his mother is a major Trump fundraiser. She reportedly attended a $1 million fundraising dinner, and her donor status was explicitly mentioned in the clemency application itself. And then he got the pardon.
And the pardon means more than just clearing his name, right?
Critically, yes.
Yeah.
The sources emphasize that because of the pardon, Walzak no longer has to pay back over $4 million in restitution he owed to his victims, doctors and nurses he'd ripped off.
So the victims get nothing back.
Correct. The sources call this pure pay-to-play, even bribery. You rip people off, your rich mom donates $1 million, you get pardoned, keep the money. It directly contradicts what the sentencing judge said. Wealth is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Apparently, sometimes it is.
That's quite something. Is that the only example like that?
No, there's another one mentioned. Trevor Milton, the guy who defrauded nickel investors out of $700 million.
$700 million.
Yeah. He reportedly donated $2 million to the campaign, got a pardon, and now doesn't have to pay back that $700 million either. The sources wryly note that for Milton, paying $2 million to avoid paying $700 million was probably a sound business decision.
A cynical calculation. The sources also connect this recent spree back to earlier pardons, particularly for January 6th rioters.
We do. They remind us that many people convicted in relation to January 6th, including some who assaulted police or journalists, received pardons earlier.
And there's a really disturbing follow-up detail in the material about that.
There is. It reports that some of those pardoned individuals, after being released, have gone on to be convicted of new, serious crimes. The examples given are soliciting or sexually assaulting a minor and reckless homicide.
So, pardoned for one set of crimes, then commit others. What's the message the sources say this sends?
The message, according to this analysis, is incredibly dangerous. Impunity for loyalty. Basically, if you are a foot soldier,
Yes.
if you do his bidding, you know that you're going to get a pardon.
That sounds like encouraging lawlessness.
That's exactly the fear expressed. It tells people it's fucking fine, direct quote there, to commit crimes in his name. The concern is it will just lead to more crime and more criminals.
It's described as creating a two-tiered system of justice.
Yes. One set of rules for the rich, the connected, the supporters, and another for everyone else. A total disregard for verdicts and the work of his own Justice Department.
The sources also express a lot of frustration about how this is being covered, or maybe not covered, by the media.
Yeah, there's a strong sense that if a different president, maybe a Democrat, were doing this kind of thing, the media coverage and public outrage would be significantly greater. It's framed as a media disparity, even a failure of the media.
Why do they think that is?
One concept mentioned is muzzle velocity corruption. There's just so much controversial stuff happening so fast that it becomes hard for the media and the public to keep track or focus on any one thing. It all becomes noise.
That makes sense. And the material includes insights from someone who used to be inside the process, right? Liz Oyer.
Yes, the former pardon attorney at the Department of Justice. Her interview provides a really valuable perspective. She emphasizes her role was supposed to be strictly non-political, making fair recommendations based on merit, looking at rehabilitation.
But she was fired. Why?
According to her account, she was fired after refusing to recommend restoring Mel Gibson's gun rights. She cited his documented history of domestic violence and felt the request was purely based on his fame and connections, not any actual merit, according to DOJ guidelines.
And Pam Bondi, mentioned in the sources, reportedly granted those rights right after Oyer was pushed out.
That's the sequence reported. And then there's this really chilling detail about what happened after she was fired.
What was that?
Armed federal officers were apparently sent to her home late at night to deliver a letter warning her against testifying to Congress about her experiences.
Armed officers to deliver a letter.
Yeah, described as thuggish and legally baseless intimidation in the sources. She's now suing the administration over wrongful termination and for information via FOIA.
So she's fighting back. And she contrasts the normal pardon process with what's happening now.
Absolutely. She describes the traditional process as focused on merit, non-political factors, genuine rehabilitation, often for people with old or relatively minor convictions trying to turn their lives around. She contrasts that sharply with what she sees now, a free-for-all, a marketplace for pardons based on political loyalty and money, completely ignoring DOJ guidelines.
And her successor, Ed Martin.
She characterizes him as the most political person focused entirely on MAGA loyalists. She mentions he's reportedly considering pardons for really controversial figures like members of the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, even the alleged plotters in the Whitmer kidnapping case.
Can anything be done to stop this legally?
It's difficult. The sources acknowledge the president's pardon power under the Constitution is very broad, almost absolute. It's more about norms being broken than laws. Oyer contrasts President Obama's use of clemency, which she describes as disciplined and principled, resulting in very low recidivism rates, with Trump's pardons, where, as we discussed, some recipients have already reoffended seriously.
So why does this all matter, according to Oyer and the sources?
It matters because it's about core corruption. It creates a market for pardons that average people can't access. It cements that two-tiered justice system. And crucially, it sends that dangerous message of impunity that crime pays if you're loyal or rich enough. The Walzak and Milton examples are used to show it's like a business calculation for potential criminals.
And what's her message to other public servants who might be witnessing things they disagree with?
Her message, as conveyed in the material, is basically, be brave. She urges them to lead with conviction and courage, to stand on their principles and not compromise their integrity, even if they're scared or facing pressure to stay silent. Speaking out, she argues, is vital to shine a light on corruption.
Okay, so let's try to pull these different threads together. We've looked at the tariff court challenges, the Doge initiative fallout, the policies on higher ed and students, and this pardon spree. What are the broader implications connecting these, according to the sources you shared?
Well, the overarching themes that jump out are really about the use, and some argue abuse of executive power. There's a consistent pattern described across these different areas, pushing the boundaries of authority, eroding established norms, and fostering an environment where political loyalty and financial contributions seem to outweigh merit or the rule of law. It points towards what the sources describe as pervasive corruption.
And what role does Congress play in this picture, based on the material?
Congress, particularly the Republicans in Congress, according to these sources, are portrayed as largely enabling this. They're described as essentially rubber-stamping administration policies, acting more like extensions of the White House staff than an independent branch of government, and willingly giving up their own power and oversight responsibilities.
The sources also touch on political strategy looking ahead, like to the 2026 midterms.
Yeah, there's some analysis suggesting that for opponents, the key isn't just to focus on Trump himself, but to tie him directly to the Republican Party in Congress. The goal described is to infect the rest of the party, politically speaking, with the negative perceptions surrounding these actions.
Making it a party-wide issue, not just about one person.
Exactly. They also mention the concept of thermostatic public opinion, the historical tendency for voters to swing back towards the other party after one party has held unified control for a while, seeking a check on power.
Let's quickly revisit the media's role, because the sources bring that up again towards the end. There were concerns about corporate media maybe pulling punches.
Yes. Serious concerns are raised that large corporate-owned media outlets might be afraid of Trump and are consequently toning down critical coverage to protect their own business interests, like access or avoiding lawsuits or regulatory hurdles. The sources even compare it to how dissent gets stifled in authoritarian countries.
Is there a specific example given?
There is a very specific one involving Paramount, the owner of CBS. Apparently, Trump sued CBS over how they edited a 60 Minutes interview, claiming mental anguish.
Okay.
Paramount reportedly offered $15 million to settle the suit, but Trump wants more. Now, here's the kicker. Paramount currently needs government approval for a major corporate merger.
Ah, so there's leverage.
Exactly. And the allegation made in these sources is incredibly serious. It claims the administration is deliberately holding up the merger to force Paramount to pay tribute to Trump, essentially to pay Trump personally millions of dollars to make the lawsuit go away so the merger can proceed. The sources call it pure oligarch stuff compared to Russia and label it flat-out bribery. And they note the chilling effect this kind of pressure has on journalists working within those organizations.
Is anyone pushing back effectively?
Interestingly, the sources contrast the situation with other instances where entities, like certain law firms that were targeted by the administration, did fight back successfully in court. The argument presented is that corporate media often chooses not to fight these battles because their business interests, like needing that merger approval, make them vulnerable.
Which leads to a call to action in the sources.
Yes, a direct call for people to support independent media. The conclusion drawn is that, given these pressures, large corporate-owned media outlets cannot be trusted to do the right thing in these situations.
So that wraps up our deep dive into this extensive set of sources you provided. We've covered a lot of ground court challenges on trade, the aftermath of that cost-cutting initiative, policies targeting universities and students, and the controversial use of pardons.
Yeah, drawing directly from the material you gave us, we tried to connect those dots and give you that essential shortcut to understanding these complex and, frankly, quite troubling issues.
As you digest all of this, here's maybe one final thought, something provocative from the material for you to consider. What is the cumulative effect of all these actions? When you see things happening across trade, education, justice, public health, impacting norms, institutions, what does that add up to for the systems you rely on every day?
It's definitely something to think about and maybe dig into further on your own.
Thanks again for bringing us these sources for this deep dive.